Donald Trump has claimed victory to become the 47th President of the United States. Well, what can Europe, and in particular Poland, expect from Trump's foreign policy over the next 4 years? Well, to explore this, I'm joined by Aleksandra Wiśniewska. She's a Polish MP with the Civic Coalition. Aleksandra, welcome to TV World. Thanks for taking the time.
Thank you very much for having me, Ashim.
It's a pleasure. So, what are the implications for Poland of a Trump victory?
So thankfully, Poland has had very active relations both with the Democrats and with the Republicans, with both camps of the political spectrum. And I can only assure you that Polish ties with the US are as strong as they've been before, and perhaps stronger than ever, in fact. And it is our very interest to ensure that this transatlantic bond within the whole Europe and the United States remains aligned, and that to prevent any misalignment with the White House, regardless of who actually takes the office. So we congratulated the President, Donald Trump, already. And myself, I have just returned from 2 weeks in the US, where I visited on NATO issues on the invitations of the US Department of State. Okay. Colorado, DC, Norfolk, and Maryland as well, to speak about the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and to speak about the future of NATO and the war in Ukraine as well.
And allow me to interrupt for a second, Aleksandra. So what was your takeaway from those talks about the future of NATO and Poland's role within it and the relationship within it between Poland and the US?
Absolutely. So something that has been absolutely clear is that there is a big recognition on the international arena, but specifically amongst Pentagon, amongst the congressmen as well, when it comes to the role that Poland is currently playing in Central Eastern Europe, and the fact that we, in fact, spend the most when it comes to our GDP per capita on defense spending. So it's 4.7 on defense spending. And this is, given the fact that 23 out of 32 allies are struggling to meet the 2% goal, So Poland really is a shining example of taking our defense extremely seriously, of not free-riding and not relying on cheap security.
Right. Well, clearly, I mean, this is something that Trump's been complaining about even from his previous role, yes. Previous time as president. Do you think that Poland has a role to play in urging other NATO members to actually, stump up, pay their fair share and, get things on an even keel as far as Trump is concerned? Because clearly this is going to be an issue.
I think absolutely this is what we have been doing, what I have myself been doing as well as the chair of the Polish-American caucus, and I believe that parliamentary diplomacy has a role to play here as well in strengthening our transatlantic bond. But this is what we see from Prime Minister Donald Tusk, this is what we see from our Minister of Foreign Affairs, Radosław Sikorski, who is already in touch and who has been in touch closely as well over the past weeks and months with the key security and defense advisors as well in both Democrat and Republican camp. And this is something what we've been also speaking with our French counterparts, our German counterparts, on the level of the Weimar Triangle, to ensure that there is a unity and understanding that we have to invest in the European pillar of NATO, that we as Europe have to take leadership, when it comes to our own theater of war in Ukraine, and when it comes to taking our defense industry, the European Sky Shield Initiative, which is a big lesson learned from Ukraine, extremely seriously. And one of the things that, is a good illustration of that is the fact that in Bydgoszcz, in Poland, we have our NATO Center of Excellence being currently built, and this will actually be used to implement lessons learned from Ukraine for the entirety of NATO.
Excellent. So actually putting strategic thinking into NATO's future plans.
Absolutely.
Right.
And as well as focusing on other domains such as space domain and cyber domains, which are new domains for NATO to explore, and which can be equally deadly in the future, and which we have to learn to understand, appreciate, and strategically address. Okay.
Now, I want to bring China into the conversation. Now, again, China's been, something of a bugbear of Trump's, and he's promised to place tariffs on Chinese imports into the United States. How is that going to influence the relationship between China, Europe, and the US?
Yeah. So, Ashim, one of the things which was very apparent, from my meetings in the US, from all across the political spectrum, is that indeed, when it comes to the national threat assessments from the United States, our key strategic ally, China emerges as serious or perhaps even more serious than Russia from the American perspective. And now we understand that the security and safety of the Euro-Atlantic is tied to that of security and safety of Indo-Pacific. However, as you know, we as Poland and as Europeans have very different current relations with China, and we have very strong economic ties, in fact, And I believe that as President Trump takes office, we also need to, try to develop slightly more nuance, slightly more sophistication in the understanding of how the US actually views China and Taiwan in the Pacific. However, from our perspective, what we can do is we can continue to urge China, which we already have been doing, our foreign minister has been doing, in pushing them to push for resolutions and for Russia to withdraw from Ukraine, which it can do in a day, ending the conflict in Ukraine, while at the same time also perhaps highlighting the fact that, China, as opposed to Russia, sees current world order slightly differently. So whereas Russia and its imperialist, horrifying, sort of law-breaking behavior actually is an open enemy of the United States, and of ours as well. China actually benefits from the US economic-led world order, and I believe that we'll actually rather use deterrence rather than an actual aggressive action in the Indo-Pacific. However, we have already started speaking with Japan, South Korea, Australia, other states in the Indo-Pacific, as well as with our American allies, to understand their own interest and to also communicate clearly ours.
Sure, understood. But that's largely the military aspect, and the security aspect. Yes. What about the economic aspect? Yeah. There are Chinese investments within the European Union.
Correct.
And there is the possibility, of course, of tariffs being imposed on products from the EU into the US. Have your discussions covered those areas too?
So to be frank, currently we focus primarily on the defense and security. I serve on Foreign Affairs Committee as well as National Defense Committee and NATO Subcommittee. So these are the primary focus of my defense, of my interest. But absolutely, I think when it comes to economic policy, this is something that we're looking at, and this is something that we will have to discuss, with other NATO allies. But our economic ties with China are important, and we must understand, also their security implications, of course, in the future.
Absolutely. Well, we look forward to hearing more about those conversations as they happen, Aleksandra. Now, Viktor Orbán, Hungary's Prime Minister, he said that a Trump victory will force Europe to abandon its stance on Ukraine and join him in seeking immediate peace. Now, if you put that together with Trump's statement about ending the war in a day, what does it say to you, if anything?
Ashim, Viktor Orbán said a lot of preposterous, absurd and ridiculous things that we ought not to take seriously. What we ought to take seriously on the level of the EU and on the level of the NATO as an alliance is that Hungary is going into an extremely dangerous direction, and has been Viktor Orbán visiting Putin himself with a photo op, that has been really demonstrating, in whose hands he's a useful tool of, as unfortunate as it is, and whether Fidesz in Hungary or AfD in Germany, or more extremist groupings that actually currently emerge on the level of the EU, we have to be extremely careful, in understanding whose interests they serve, whether actually financially supported or whether just useful fools, and we have to brace ourselves against that.
But how do you see Trump's relationship with Orbán developing in light of what you said just a few minutes ago about the relationship with Poland and other countries in Europe?
So President Donald Trump will not be in a position any longer, He will actually be a chief of state, And in that case, I believe that critical allies, such as Poland, on the level of the Eastern Europe, the leader of NATO's eastern flank, here will have and a key to humanitarian and military support to Ukraine will have a big role to play. And when it comes to the Ukraine war, today is the 984th day of the war in Ukraine since the Russian invasion, on the 24th of February. And President Zelensky has already addressed and congratulated the President Donald Trump his electoral victory. And, from the Polish perspective, we must support Ukraine and we must ensure that the war is being pushed from our EU borders as far as possible. And it is in our very much strategic interest that Ukraine wins and that victory is defined however President Zelensky believes it should be defined. And we know that Russia could end this war in a day by withdrawing from the territories of Ukraine, withdrawing from Donetsk and Luhansk and stopping its aggression.
Yes, but how likely do you think that is? And is there something that Trump can do to accelerate the process?
I believe that President Donald Trump, will take its own decisions. Poland will not obviously meddle in the internal interests of our key strategic ally. However, what will we advocate for is continued ammunition, continued financial, military and humanitarian aid to Ukraine. And we've been following the supplemental debate on the level of Congress very closely, because not all decisions are being taken by the administration, some are taken on the level of the Congress, which led me to speak with the congressman during my last US visit as well. And we've been holding our breath for the passing of a supplemental bill. Poland has given over 45 aid packages to Ukraine, and continues to be critical in continuous military aid to Ukraine. And let us remember, that in Ukraine currently, people are dying for daring to associate themselves with the ideas of the EU and for daring to associate themselves with the ideas of NATO. And if this heroic, romantic David versus Goliath fight, is not to reignite our belief in NATO as an alliance, and that really has strengthened our alliance that, until recently has been called brain dead by some, suddenly is stronger than ever. And this is due to Ukraine's heroic fight that we ought to support.
Right. Now, in terms of, you mentioned Congress
Yes.
and the Senate. Do you expect any shift in their attitude towards the supply of materiel to Ukraine?
So we do see, that there has been a certain transactional or isolationist trend emerging in certain parts of the American society. And I believe this, from my understanding, comes from the insufficient communication, insufficient advocacy that in fact Europe is not free riding, that we're taking defense spending and military spending and humanitarian spending extremely seriously, and here we don't rely on America, on the US picking up the slack, So here I believe that as long as we will be able to advocate that interest, showing also how it relieves the US, from propose a huge amount of additional support that they can actually look into in the Pacific, in their own interest,
Right.
That I hope that this can continue, and that we can continue ensuring as strong support as possible. Because what is the economic alternative? What is the economic alternative for an American taxpayer, for a Polish taxpayer, if, touch wood, Kiev was to fall? That is catastrophic, for global order, for the global economy as well, and we understand it extremely clearly.
Yes, but there does seem to be quite a lot of kickback against the supply of armaments to Ukraine, where people are saying, well, you should be spending that money in the US on infrastructure and other areas. How do you think President Trump and his cabinet are going to balance those tensions?
I mean, I do trust, that there are certain things when the historical times like these come, interesting times that really call us to rise to a level of responsibility. And in the US, you have such beautiful history, of rising to responsibility as a world leader, when it comes to sort of the democracy, freedom, pursuit of happiness, And we very much trust, that the Donald Trump administration will continue the trend, as well as the trend of the, old school Republicans, of Ronald Reagan, of John McCain,
Right.
Who have showed through their own public service, that when there is a fire in the world, they're ready to respond, they're ready to support, and be really a leader of an alliance that rests on values and not on transactionality.
Well, we certainly look forward to that happening. Aleksandra Wiśniewska, thank you very much indeed for sharing your analysis with our audience. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you very much.
And that's all from us in this episode of World Talks. Don't go away, lots more coming up as always. Goodbye from me.